Imagine a justice system so deranged it punished people for things that weren't even crimes, yet somehow forgot to punish the people who invented the punishments. And trust me, it only gets worse from here. 1. A certain ancient kingdom believed justice worked best when filtered through pure nonsense, so they invented a punishment called the angry river decision, where a person accused of wrongdoing was tossed into a fast-moving current because officials assumed the river would naturally reject the guilty and politely return the innocent to shore. What actually happened, of course, was that everyone, saints, sinners, and random bystanders, all received the same verdict: a frantic downstream ride ending in bruises, broken dignity, and the occasional unfortunate disappearance. Officials insisted the system was flawless, claiming anyone who didn't float back must have been extremely guilty. Meanwhile, the surviving innocent had to pretend the whole experience taught them a valuable moral lesson, even though the only lesson they gained was that justice conducted by hydrologically illiterate bureaucrats produces nothing except wet confusion and a strong desire to move to literally any other civilization. 2. One ancient city devised a brilliant plan to discourage lying, a punishment where the accused was forced to lick a heated metal spoon in public. The governing council swore it was a reliable test because the guilty tongue will blister, as if innocent tongues were made of asbestos. So anyone accused of dishonesty, whether they stole a goat or simply annoyed the wrong official, was marched out, presented with a glowing utensil, and told to demonstrate moral purity by doing something that would make modern safety inspectors evacuate the entire town. Predictably, every participant ended up with burns, no matter their innocence. But the council refused to admit the flaw because acknowledging reality wasn't part of the job description. The real lesson was not "don't lie," but "don't get accused," especially if the judges believed metallurgy made them human truth detectors instead of sadists with cookware. 3. Somewhere in the Bronze Age, a ruler convinced himself that laziness was society's greatest threat. So he created a punishment for insufficient enthusiasm, a crime defined entirely by whether he personally felt someone looked too relaxed. The punishment involved tying the accused to a rotating grain wheel so that, in a poetic twist, the supposedly lazy person spent hours powering the kingdom's agriculture like a disgruntled hamster. It didn't matter if they'd worked a double shift or simply blinked too slowly during the king's speech. Anyone appearing insufficiently thrilled about life found themselves strapped to a machine that turned exhaustion into civic duty. The ruling elite applauded this as visionary social engineering, while the working population quietly wondered if the wheel was less a punishment and more a preview of their entire future. It was an early example of productivity culture weaponized by a monarch with unlimited authority and zero empathy. 4. In a coastal civilization that loved symbolic justice almost as much as it misunderstood basic oceanography, lawmakers created a punishment for petty theft called the trial of the hungry fish. Officials would row the accused a short distance offshore, drop them into shark-adjacent waters, and announce that any attacker would represent divine judgment. Naturally, the sharks did not participate according to the script, and most of the time the accused just treaded water awkwardly until someone decided the suspense was getting boring and pulled them back in. Still, lawmakers praised the elegance of the system, insisting that the sea sees all, even though the sea demonstrably saw nothing and mercifully ignored them. The accused often returned with the same complaint. Not that they'd nearly been eaten, but that the entire ordeal felt like being punished by people who got their theology from rumors and their legal framework from a bucket of driftwood. 5. A certain ancient empire had a bizarre fondness for theatrical justice and invented a punishment called the cloak of bees, which involved wrapping the accused in honey-soaked cloth and releasing them into a field buzzing with irritated insects. The idea, officials declared, was that bees, being noble and industrious, could detect corruption and deliver morally calibrated stings. In reality, the bees acted like bees, stinging anyone who smelled like a walking dessert bar. People guilty of crimes, people guilty of nothing, and people guilty only of standing too close during a festival all got equally decorated with swollen welts. Leaders insisted this was proof of the method's spiritual seriousness, ignoring how every trial ended with the same outcome: frantic screaming and a defendant sprinting across a meadow like a rejected character from a nature documentary. It was justice via pollination, brought to you by lawmakers who apparently thought insects doubled as ethical consultants. 6. One kingdom with a flair for culinary vengeance invented a punishment that required the accused to eat an entire bowl of scorching spices under the watchful eyes of the court. The logic was that a guilty person's soul would recoil, conveniently ignoring the fact that everyone's digestive system recoils at the equivalent of swallowing powdered fire. This system turned even minor disputes, like borrowing a pot and forgetting to return it, into gastrointestinal combat. Observers claimed the innocent would handle it better, though all anyone actually saw was a parade of sweating, wheezing, red-faced defendants, questioning every life decision that led them to a courtroom run by people who believed morality could be measured in teaspoons of capsaicin. After the verdict, judges would nod sagely, pretending they'd learned something profound from the spectacle, while the accused limped home praying their stomach didn't declare war in the next 24 hours. 7. There existed a desert tribe convinced the cosmos cared deeply about contractual disputes, so they devised a punishment that required the accused to stand barefoot on sun-baked stones until someone, usually a bored elder, declared the gods had spoken. The trial lasted anywhere from minutes to hours, depending on how hot the day was or how long the elders felt like watching free entertainment. Those accused of even the smallest offense, like forgetting to deliver a message, found themselves doing a reluctant impression of a frying pan on tray. The elders insisted that blistered feet indicated guilt, though blistered feet were guaranteed no matter who stood there unless they possessed supernatural heat resistance. The entire system revealed less about divine judgment and more about the willingness of lawmakers to outsource critical thinking to the weather. 8. In one mountain society, lawmakers believed fear was a more reliable motivator than reason, so they created a punishment where the accused was blindfolded and forced to walk across a narrow ledge while villagers shouted discouraging remarks for thematic effect. The idea was to simulate the perilous path of truth, as if truth were something you found while avoiding a fatal tumble. The ledge wasn't actually meant to kill anyone. It was just high enough to create embarrassing panic without generating too much paperwork. Yet accidents still happened, and leaders always blamed the victim's lack of moral balance, proudly ignoring the fact that the punishment was essentially hazardous parkour created by people who didn't know what parkour was. As long as the spectacle impressed the crowd, the system remained firmly in place, a monument to legal innovation shaped by poor architecture. 9. One ancient ruler had a personal vendetta against gossip and created a punishment where offenders had to shout their alleged lies into a deep cavern. Supposedly so, the earth could judge the truth by answering with an echo. If the cavern echoed back sharply, the person was guilty. If the echo was soft, they were somehow absolved. Naturally, geography, not morality, determined everything. But officials pretended the acoustics were spiritually significant. People accused of trivial slander found themselves standing at the cave entrance rehearsing their sentences like performers preparing for a disastrous audition. The echo always returned, because that's what caves do. But the court interpreted each resonance according to whatever political mood they were in. The only reliable outcome was that the accused walked away feeling they'd just been judged by geology rather than justice. 10. A nomadic clan believed punishment should be instructive, so they created a ritual where offenders were tied to a symbolic burden pole that represented the weight of their mistakes. Unfortunately, the pole weighed about as much as a stubborn yak, and the accused had to drag it across the camp while elders criticized their form like disappointed gym instructors. This display allegedly purified the soul, though it mostly strengthened the spectator's ability to suppress laughter. People accused of minor errors, like misplacing a cooking pot, ended up reenacting a slow, sweaty version of an endurance competition designed by someone who thought enlightenment required pulled muscles. If the accused fell, they were told it was symbolic. If they succeeded, that was also symbolic. Basically, everything was symbolic except the physical pain, which was extremely literal. 11. In one early republic, lawmakers decided that dishonor should produce both humiliation and inconvenience, so they introduced a punishment called the public cargo walk. Offenders were forced to march through the central marketplace carrying huge bundles of firewood or grain larger than their own torso, while crowds offered unsolicited commentary on their technique. Officials promised the ritual would restore balance to the community, though everyone knew it was just outdoor manual labor disguised as philosophy. People convicted of small infractions, like speaking out of turn during council meetings, found themselves muttering apologies beneath a wobbling tower of logs. It taught nothing except that governments love pretending their punitive chores are spiritual lessons, a tradition that, unfortunately, has survived across centuries. 12. An agricultural society once believed the moon dictated justice, so they created a punishment requiring offenders to kneel in an open field all night while staring at the moon to receive cosmic correction. If clouds blocked the moon, the accused still had to remain in place because officials insisted the moon knew they were there. Kneeling for hours on uneven soil provided all the correction anyone could possibly need, though officials swore the true punishment was metaphysical. People who couldn't stay awake were accused of disrespecting celestial law, and those who stayed awake were accused of overthinking it. Essentially, the only way to win was to never get accused in the first place. 13. A river valley civilization created a punishment involving forced participation in something they grandly called the ceremony of 1,000 apologies, though 1,000 was metaphorical unless the council was feeling particularly petty. The accused had to stand before the entire community and recite a long list of apologies for offenses both real and imagined, including some supplied by officials who clearly enjoyed their creative writing exercises. Anyone who stumbled over the memorized lines was declared insincere and sent back to the beginning like a malfunctioning storyteller. The entire ordeal revealed nothing about justice, but plenty about the entertainment value of watching someone deliver a marathon performance of social regret. 14. One ancient court loved symbolic punishment so deeply that they punished tax evaders by forcing them to wear an oversized clay pot on their heads while sweeping the public square. Judges claimed the pot symbolized the burden of civic responsibility, though it mostly symbolized an inability to see anything while repeatedly hitting one's shins with a broom. The pot restricted breathing just enough to make the spectacle dramatic without requiring medical assistance, assuming the offender didn't panic and run into a vendor stall. Citizens watched the slow-moving pottery monsters with fascination, fully aware the punishment existed solely because lawmakers preferred poetic metaphors to functional governance. 15. A northern tribe believed that arguments drained communal harmony, so they punished quarrelers by making them sit back-to-back for hours while bound together with a single rope. Officials insisted the punishment encouraged unity, though the only unity produced was mutual resentment and synchronized complaining. People bound together often had wildly different body sizes, resulting in a lopsided sitting arrangement that made both participants regret ever opening their mouths. Spectators often placed bets on which bound complainer would topple over first, not because they supported the justice system, but because the justice system had, without realizing it, created the region's most popular spectator sport. 16. In a coastal fortress state, lawmakers punished cowardice by forcing the accused to stand atop a windy battlement holding a shield so oversized it functioned more like a sail. The idea was to teach resilience, though it mostly taught people that wind has no respect for legal symbolism. Offenders endured hours of wobbling humiliation as gusts threatened to fling them off the wall, while guards below offered technical critiques like unhelpful sports commentators. The punishment was less about bravery and more about surviving a physics experiment designed by people who understood neither physics nor mercy. 17. One kingdom obsessed with purity rituals required accused criminals to undergo the smoke of truth, which meant sitting inside a small hut filled with incense so thick it could fumigate an elephant. Officials believed that guilty people would cough more, as though respiratory systems cared about moral nuance. Everyone emerged coughing like they'd inhaled an entire spice market. Judges claimed to detect meaningful patterns in the coughing fits, crafting verdicts the way fortune tellers read tea leaves. The defendants, meanwhile, staggered out red-eyed and dizzy, newly aware that their fate depended entirely on the herbal preferences of lawmakers who seemed more committed to aromatherapy than justice. 18. In one ancient federation of city-states, leaders created a punishment for unproductive complaining, a crime so vague it basically meant talking out loud near someone important. And the penalty involved sitting in the marketplace strapped to a wooden chair while merchants placed symbolic weights on your lap to represent the burdens you place on society. These weights were not light. Some were carved stone slabs decorated with motivational proverbs, as if the combination of back pain and unsolicited wisdom might transform someone into a model citizen. The accused often tried arguing that the punishment itself was the real burden, but this only added more symbolic stones because complaining while being punished for complaining was treated as a philosophical outrage. Meanwhile, the public watched with the same fascination reserved for a slow-motion disaster, silently grateful that at least this time they weren't the ones reenacting a productivity seminar designed by people who had never done an honest day's work. 19. A certain mountainous kingdom, famous for its cold winters and colder bureaucracy, used a punishment known as the Hall of Echoing Shivers, where offenders were forced to stand nearly unclothed inside a stone chamber engineered to amplify the sound of their own teeth chattering. Officials believed the echo was spiritually corrective, as though the acoustics would bully someone into moral clarity. The chamber itself was intentionally drafty, with tiny carved openings that let the wind whistle through like an overly dramatic soundtrack, and the guards took great joy in reminding the accused that the mountain forgives only the worthy, which was a poetic way of saying absolutely nothing. People punished under this system walked out trembling not from guilt, but because their body temperature had taken a vacation, and yet the officials congratulated themselves on their brilliance, proudly mistaking hypothermia for enlightenment. 20. One coastal civilization with a strong fishing economy invented a punishment clearly designed by someone who had been personally wronged by a clam. They called it the shell of reflection. The accused was locked inside a giant wooden clamshell that closed around them like a budget mythological trap, leaving them to sit in cramped darkness as officials claimed they were being symbolically swallowed by their wrongdoing. The shell didn't kill anyone, but it did smell like something that had definitely died, thanks to the mix of humidity, sea air, and leftover fish residue nobody bothered to clean out. The accused emerged drenched, sore, and deeply aware that the real crime wasn't theirs, but the carpenter's lack of ventilation skills. Yet lawmakers insisted that time inside the shell offered profound moral clarity, proving they confused spiritual transformation with the experience of being stored like unsold seafood. 21. A desert empire once punished tax evaders by assigning them to a task called carrying the public silence, which sounds poetic until you realize it meant hauling enormous jars of sand from one end of the city to the other for no practical purpose whatsoever. The jars represented the weight of civic neglect, though everyone knew they mostly represented the tax minister's creativity running unchecked. Offenders were expected to complete the task without speaking, sneezing, or dropping a single grain, a standard so unrealistic it basically guaranteed failure. Citizens often lined the streets to watch, not out of malice, but because watching someone tiptoe around with jars larger than their torso was the ancient equivalent of binge-watching slapstick comedy. Officials, meanwhile, pretended the whole ordeal was dignified civic theater, even as the accused spent hours perfecting the art of sweating in silence. 22. In one northern territory, lawmakers enforced honesty by sentencing liars to spend an evening tied to a truth beacon, which was just a tall wooden pole wrapped in burning resin-soaked ropes. Offenders weren't burned. The ropes were suspended just high enough, but they were close enough to feel the heat and smell the smoke, all while guards chanted moral slogans that sounded like they'd been copied from motivational pottery. The idea was that proximity to fire would purify deceit, as if truth were something you could roast into someone. Most offenders came away with scorched eyebrows and a lifelong distrust of campfires. Officials embarrassingly insisted the ritual was transformative, though the only transformation happening was fresh fear of timber-related justice. But since no one in charge wanted to admit they'd invented a bonfire you couldn't enjoy, the practice continued for generations. 23. A deep forest society created a punishment for petty crimes called walking with the trees, which sounded whimsical until the accused learned it, involved being tied to a series of young saplings and forced to shuffle forward as each tree bent and released in awkward sequence. Officials claimed the trees guided offenders toward wisdom, though the real guiding force was the hope of not face-planting into the underbrush. The entire performance looked like an unintentionally comedic parade of humans reluctantly impersonating marionettes, handled by someone with bad coordination. Elders insisted the ritual symbolized harmony with nature, but the only harmony achieved was the shared annoyance between the participant and the saplings. Spectators occasionally applauded, not out of support, but because the spectacle resembled a living cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing horticultural enthusiasts to write criminal codes. 24. One wealthy ancient court obsessed with propriety created a punishment for anyone who disrupted public ceremonies. The offender had to serve as a still statue of remorse, standing perfectly motionless in the town square while wearing a stone mask that resembled whichever god was in fashion that season. The mask was heavy enough to strain neck muscles, but officials insisted the discomfort helped cultivate humility. Citizens, meanwhile, treated the statues like decorative props, occasionally hanging ribbons or placing fruit nearby, not out of kindness, but because they enjoyed seeing if the accused would crack and flinch. Anyone who moved, even to sneeze, was declared spiritually unstable and forced to repeat the performance. The punishment proved remarkably effective at one thing: encouraging people to respect ceremonies, not because they valued tradition, but because they feared being turned into a breathing lawn ornament. 25. In a kingdom known for its dramatic flair, lawmakers punished arrogance by making offenders parade through the streets wearing an oversized wooden crown too heavy for any normal posture. The crown symbolized the weight of undeserved pride, though it mostly symbolized the government's enthusiasm for building props that doubled as orthopedic hazards. Offenders staggered around trying not to topple over while citizens debated whether the spectacle was tragic, hilarious, or both. Officials pretended the ritual instilled humility, but the only thing being instilled was chronic neck pain. The punishment became a strangely popular tourist attraction, proving once again that ancient societies excelled at transforming personal disaster into community entertainment long before reality television made it fashionable. 26. A Highland tribe with a strict moral code punished chronic interrupters by forcing them to sit on a carved wooden bench known as the listener's seat, where they had to remain silent while people told long, meandering stories about nothing in particular. The stories often involved farming mishaps, unremarkable weather, or arguments with goats, topics specifically chosen for maximum boredom. The offender was not allowed to interrupt, correct details, or ask questions. They simply had to endure the slow erosion of their willpower. Officials believed this punishment restored conversational balance, though it mostly demonstrated how weaponized storytelling could be. The listener's seat became legendary not for rehabilitating behavior, but for producing the fastest-growing collection of adults who feared small talk more than the crime itself. 27. An ancient island nation punished cowards by making them perform a ritual swim through a shallow lagoon filled with harmless but extremely judgmental-looking birds. The birds, known for their uncanny ability to glare like disapproving schoolteachers, would line the shore as the offender splashed awkwardly through water barely knee-deep. Officials claimed the ritual rebuilt courage, though the only danger present was tripping over a shell. Still, the humiliation of being silently judged by an entire avian congregation was apparently powerful enough to correct behavior. Villagers later admitted the birds weren't actually magical, they just had very expressive faces. Yet leaders continued pretending the ritual worked, because no one wanted to admit their kingdom's justice system relied on emotional intimidation delivered by wildlife. 28. A sun-worshipping culture created a punishment for thieves that required them to stand atop a stone platform at midday, holding polished bronze plates to reflect sunlight directly into their own faces. The idea was that the brightness would cleanse dishonesty, though the only thing being cleansed was the offender's ability to see straight afterward. The bronze plates were heavy, the sun was unforgiving, and the platform conveniently lacked shade, transforming the experience into a slow roast under the guise of civic purification. People watching the ritual often wore wide-brimmed hats, not out of empathy, but because they didn't want to be accidentally blinded by the moral laser show happening in front of them. The officials, of course, declared the punishment a triumph of solar virtue, ignoring the obvious fact that it mostly produced headaches and temporary blindness. 29. In a society known for its love of riddles, lawmakers punished anyone who broke contractual agreements by forcing them to solve an elaborate puzzle box in front of the community. The puzzle had no practical purpose other than demonstrating how much patience the accused had left after being shamed publicly. If they solved it quickly, judges accused them of rushing. If they solved it slowly, they were accused of feigned incompetence. Failing to solve it at all meant additional penalties. Citizens didn't watch for justice. They watched to see how long it would take the box to break the accused's spirit. The lawmakers proudly claimed the ritual preserved intellectual integrity, though it mostly preserved their reputation as people who thought wooden brain teasers were legally binding instruments. 30. A river delta kingdom punished chronic lateness by forcing offenders to spend several hours placing stones along the riverbank, according to a schedule that changed unpredictably throughout the day. Each time the overseer struck a small gong, the offender had to stop, rearrange the stones, and pretend to understand the significance of the pattern they were creating. Officials insisted this ritual taught respect for time. though it actually taught respect for the overseer's ability to misuse a gong. Spectators enjoyed the spectacle because nothing was more entertaining than watching someone try to interpret the artistic whims of a bureaucrat with too much authority and not enough hobbies. 31. One ancient monarchy punished disrespect toward elders by requiring offenders to participate in a ceremony called the Hour of Listening, where they sat in a formal hall while senior citizens recited long lists of grievances about everything wrong with society, from modern footwear to poorly trained goats. The offender had to sit politely through every complaint, nodding at appropriate intervals, even when the grievances veered into topics that hadn't been relevant in decades. Leaders claimed this ceremony upheld tradition, though it mostly provided free therapy for the elders. Offenders left feeling like they'd aged 20 years in one sitting, and lawmakers considered that evidence of success. 32. A hilltop republic believed courage could be taught through mild terror. So they invented a punishment where offenders had to sit on a flat stone overlooking a steep cliff, while officials asked a series of rhetorical questions about life choices. Guards stood nearby to prevent falls, though their main job was dramatically gesturing toward the abyss for emotional effect. The offender wasn't actually in danger, but the psychological pressure was enough to make anyone reconsider every decision they'd ever made, including the decision to live in a republic run by part-time philosophers and full-time dramatists. When the ritual ended, officials congratulated themselves for building character, though the accused mostly gained a strong dislike for cliffs and rhetorical questions. 33. A frigid tundra settlement created a punishment for wastefulness by requiring the offender to stand guard over an ice block for an entire night, ensuring it didn't melt unnecessarily, which was impressive since the temperature rarely rose above freezing. The point wasn't to protect the ice. There was plenty of ice. The point was to teach responsibility through pointless vigilance. The offender stood shivering in the dark, staring at a perfectly immobile cube, while elders claimed they were preserving community resources. In reality, they were preserving their own amusement, watching someone freeze alongside an object that couldn't possibly melt unless the sun suddenly filed a complaint. 34. In a ceremonial city obsessed with symbolic rebirth, offenders were punished by being born again through a ritual that involved crawling through a narrow clay tunnel the width of a stubborn goat. The officials insisted this represented leaving one's old self behind, though it mainly represented the city's total lack of concern for personal comfort. The tunnel scraped elbows, bruised ribs, and occasionally trapped people halfway through, prompting attendants to lightly shove their feet for motivation. Spectators found the ritual inspiring, not because of the symbolism, but because watching a grown adult wriggle through a mud cylinder was surprisingly entertaining. Officials praised the ceremony's spiritual significance, while the accused tried to regain feeling in their limbs. 35. In a swampy lowland kingdom where officials believed nature was the wisest judge, offenders were sentenced to the trial of the patient crocodile, which sounds like a children's book until you learn the accused had to sit on a wooden stool near a crocodile pit and remain perfectly still while the reptiles lounged nearby like scaly jurors deciding whether lunch was justified. The idea was that the innocent would project calm energy, and the guilty would attract consequences, as though crocodiles made moral distinctions instead of simply going after whatever moved first. Guards insisted the beasts were unusually discerning, but eyewitnesses noticed their so-called judgment varied entirely with feeding schedules. Some offenders left with nothing but mosquito bites and a dramatic story. Others left noticeably faster because the crocodile jury had reached a unanimous culinary verdict. Officials continued defending the process, claiming anyone eaten must have harbored deep internal guilt, which is a convenient policy when your legal system is basically a reptile buffet. 36. A fog-shrouded northern enclave introduced a punishment for disturbing communal peace, meaning anything from shouting to sneezing too enthusiastically, and offenders were forced to walk through the village wearing what they called the cloak of whispers, essentially a giant hood made from stitched animal skins that funneled every sound the wearer made directly back into their own ears. The effect was unsettling. Each breath sounded like a dramatic monologue, and every footstep echoed as though the offender were starring in their own unwanted psychological thriller. Leaders claimed the cloak encouraged introspection, though it mostly encouraged dizziness and existential dread. Children followed the offenders around, amused that adults were being punished by artisanal acoustics, while elders praised the system's innovation, ignoring the fact that the innovation was basically a wearable cave. people emerged from the ritual convinced not of their guilt, but that the fur-working guild had way too much power in municipal decision-making. 37. A warlike Highland nation invented a punishment for cowardice that involved standing on a hilltop holding an impossibly long ceremonial spear while being required to shout heroic phrases into the valley below, even if the offender had no heroic qualities whatsoever. The spear acted like a lightning rod for embarrassment, swaying dangerously in the wind while the offender yelled scripted epics about valor, destiny, and unbroken spirit, all while livestock grazed nearby with unimpressed expressions. Officials insisted the ritual restored courage, though the only thing being restored was the village's appetite for mockery. Spectators gathered at a distance just to hear the wind distort the shouts, turning them into accidental comedy. And if the offender faltered or forgot a line, the elders demanded they start from the beginning, as though courage could be upgraded through repeated public mortification. By the end, people weren't braver. They were simply determined never to be caught hesitating again. 38. In a prosperous river kingdom obsessed with orderly conduct, lawmakers punished rule breakers by assigning them to a task they called the unending line, where the offender had to stand in a serpentine queue composed entirely of wooden mannequins, painted to resemble impatient citizens. The offender had to shuffle forward at glacial speed, occasionally bowing to each mannequin while officials observed to ensure proper etiquette. The setup created the illusion of a crowd, except this crowd never moved naturally, never judged silently, and never coughed at awkward moments like real people, which arguably made it creepier. The government claimed the ritual cultivated patience, though it mostly cultivated a deep suspicion of carpentry and false social interactions. After hours of bowing to wooden strangers who could neither appreciate nor resent the gesture, offenders often emerged disoriented, convinced they had achieved enlightenment, or more realistically, suffered through the most boring hallucination ever legislated. 39. A desert confederation with a flair for spectacle invented a punishment for deception called the Sand of Truth, where the accused was buried up to the neck in soft sand at the edge of the marketplace, while officials asked questions and claimed the movement of the sand around the person indicated honesty. The truth, of course, was that sand shifts because sand shifts, but officials insisted each ripple carried cosmic significance. If the wind blew too hard, the accused was declared untrustworthy. If it didn't blow at all, they were accused of resisting fate. Locals gathered to watch the ritual, not for justice, but because nothing beat the entertainment value of watching someone try to look dignified while slowly resembling a buried garden ornament. The Confederation proudly defended the process, claiming it honored the desert spirits, though the desert spirits likely had better things to do than referee human drama. 40. A tropical island civilization introduced a punishment for greed that involved placing the offender inside a circular bamboo pen and requiring them to chase a hanging pouch of coins suspended just out of reach by a long, flexible pole. Every step made the pouch bounce tantalizingly, turning the spectacle into a slow-motion parody of ambition. Officials insisted the ritual taught humility, though it mostly taught the durability limits of bamboo. Children loved it because it combined educational theater with the comedic value of watching a grown adult repeatedly leap for a prize they would never be allowed to keep. Spectators occasionally tried to give advice, like they were coaching an athletic event, despite knowing the point was not to succeed, but to look foolish. When the offender finally collapsed from exhaustion, officials nodded solemnly, declaring the ritual complete, as if the lesson had been profound rather than painfully literal. 41. In a mountainous spiritual sect that believed echoes carried divine messages, offenders were punished by being sent into a cavern and required to recite poetry selected by the council, typically long, meandering verses about discipline and cosmic balance. The cavern returned their words with dramatic reverberation that made every line sound unintentionally theatrical, as though the accused were auditioning for a role in a very confused opera. The sect insisted the ritual aligned the offender's energy with universal harmony, though the only energy being aligned was the listener's desire to escape. Some echo patterns were interpreted as approval, others were deemed signs of defiance, though nobody agreed on which was which. Offenders emerged with sore throats, heightened self-awareness, and profound skepticism that the universe cared about poorly written poetry. Yet the council continued the tradition proudly, even commissioning new verses that made the ordeal longer and even less tolerable. 42. A windswept coastal republic punished petty corruption by making the offender serve as a living weather vane on the public roof, standing on a narrow platform and pointing their arms in the direction of the wind for an entire day. The punishment wasn't dangerous, but it was humiliating, especially since townspeople placed bets on how long before the offender lost track of the wind and accidentally pointed the wrong direction. Officials insisted the process was symbolic of redirecting civic virtue, though it mostly symbolized the Republic's commitment to inventing punishments that doubled as meteorological theater. Seagulls frequently participated by perching nearby and staring at the offender as though silently judging their wingless incompetence. When storms approached, guards hurried to bring the offender down, not out of mercy, but to prevent them from being blown off and disrupting the Republic's precious record-keeping. 43. A misty highland valley known for its elaborate rituals created a punishment for insufficient respect toward sacred places, which meant stepping on the wrong rock or sneezing too loudly near a shrine. Offenders were required to perform an intricate dance around the shrine while wearing a mask so large it could have doubled as a siege shield. The dance involved hopping, bowing, and spinning, three motions that should never be combined while wearing a mask with limited visibility. Officials said the ritual restored spiritual alignment, though it mostly restored confidence in the valley's thriving mask-making industry. Villagers observed the ceremony while trying not to laugh, though many failed, especially when the offender tripped over their own symbolic reverence. By the end, the offender looked less spiritually aligned and more like someone caught mid-escape from a circus nobody asked for. 44. A maritime kingdom with alarming confidence in marine animals developed a punishment for betrayal called the Whispering Tide. The offender was tied to a post in shallow water during low tide and left there while the salt water slowly rose. Officials claimed the tide carried the confessions of the guilty, though it mostly carried seaweed and small crabs that viewed the offender as temporary real estate. Guards monitored the ritual closely to ensure no one drowned, not because they valued justice, but because drowned offenders couldn't be taxed later. Locals claimed to hear mystical messages in the gentle waves, though it was often just the sound of the offender complaining through chattering teeth. The ritual ended when the water reached chest height, at which point officials declared the ocean had spoken, even though the ocean had clearly said nothing except "I exist." 45. A nomadic plains tribe punished chronic boasters by having them ride a stubborn pack animal around the camp while announcing their achievements through a hollowed-out horn that made everything sound either dramatic or ridiculous, depending on wind direction. The animal, often as unimpressed as the tribe, would occasionally stop or turn unexpectedly, forcing the offender to improvise speeches while clinging to dignity and the saddle simultaneously. Officials believed the ritual revealed the truth behind boasting, since no brag sounded impressive when broadcast through a horn that made every word vibrate like an enthusiastic goose. Children followed the procession giggling, while elders nodded sagely as though watching a sacred rite rather than a glorified mock parade. By the end, the offender usually revised their bragging habits, not because of spiritual awakening, but because they were tired of being the unwilling star of a mobile comedic performance. 46. In a volcanic island nation, lawmakers punished food thieves by sentencing them to sit near an active fummeral, a steaming volcanic vent, with a pot of inedible clay stew they had to guard as though it were a national treasure. Officials claimed the ritual taught restraint, since the offender had to sit near real heat without touching anything useful. Meanwhile, locals treated the ritual like a public barbecue without food. They watched steam rise dramatically while the offender sweated in a theatrical haze. The clay stew bubbled ominously, not from culinary ambition, but from geothermal insult. People said the ritual purified the mind, though it mainly purified pores. When the sentence ended, the offender left dehydrated, smoky, and fully convinced that stealing food was far less painful than babysitting a pot of geological disappointment. 47. A grand empire known for its extravagant bureaucracy punished disobedient scribes by forcing them to copy the same meaningless phrase thousands of times on clay tablets, a task officials claimed would etch discipline into the spirit, while mostly etching boredom into the wrists. To make matters worse, supervisors inspected each tablet for inconsistencies, pretending they could detect moral character based on handwriting variation. The phrase itself changed every season, ranging from lofty philosophical nonsense to motivational slogans nobody believed, but the monotony stayed eternal. Scholars later claimed the punishment boosted literacy rates, though offenders insisted it only boosted resentment. By the end, the scribe's handwriting usually resembled the frantic scratching of someone trying to escape through the tablet surface. which officials ironically interpreted as improved dedication. 48. A storm-obsessed peninsula kingdom punished disrespect toward elders by assigning offenders to the Storm Tower, where they had to sit at the top and record wind patterns using symbols that meant absolutely nothing. Officials claimed the symbols represented cosmic insight, though even they disagreed on what they meant. Offenders spent hours watching clouds drift by while pretending to decipher atmospheric mysteries, hoping no lightning appeared to add unwanted commentary. Onlookers treated the ritual as high entertainment, betting on how long before the offender invented new symbols out of boredom. When the night ended, officials reviewed the nonsense scribbles with scholarly seriousness before declaring the offender enlightened or disappointing, criteria so vague they might as well have flipped a coin. 49. A chilly northern duchy invented a punishment for frivolous disruptions, a term broad enough to include coughing at the wrong moment, by forcing offenders to stand in the town square wearing a cloak covered in small bells. The offender had to remain silent while the bells jingled with every involuntary twitch, creating a soundtrack of mild humiliation. The duchy claimed the ritual revealed the offender's inner noise, which is bureaucratic poetry for "we enjoy controlling people." Children often walked in circles around the bell-cloaked offender just to generate extra jingling, while vendors used the sound as an advertising opportunity. When the punishment ended, the offender walked away convinced silence was overrated, mainly because they hadn't experienced it in hours. 50. Nearing the end of the stupidity spectrum, a sprawling desert empire punished liars by making them identify constellations invented specifically for the punishment. Officials pointed at random clumps of stars and demanded the offender recite mythic tales connected to them, tales they'd never heard because they didn't exist until that moment. If the offender hesitated, they were accused of resisting cosmic truth. If they improvised, they were accused of fabricating celestial stories, which was technically the point but legally frowned upon. The punishment didn't teach honesty, it taught creative storytelling under duress. Scholars later claimed it enriched oral tradition, though offenders insisted it simply enriched the empire's collection of cosmic nonsense. 51. And finally, the crown jewel of human judicial genius. A kingdom that punished blasphemy by forcing offenders to apologize directly to an empty throne said to be reserved for the gods, a throne so elaborately decorated that it looked like a furniture store hallucinating. The offender had to deliver a heartfelt apology while priests translated their words into what they called divine interpretation, which miraculously always matched whatever verdict the priests wanted. If the offender paused, priests claimed the gods were offended. If they spoke too long, the gods were impatient. If they spoke normally, the gods were unimpressed. The entire ritual was essentially performance art for an audience that didn't exist, culminating in a verdict delivered by people pretending they could hear celestial feedback from a chair. And that truly is the peak of ancient punishment. Humans arguing with furniture and calling it justice. After all that, it's honestly impressive the ancient world didn't just fine everyone for breathing too loudly. So go ahead, vote for the dumbest punishment in the comments. Toss a like on this historical chaos and subscribe if you're ready for even weirder human decisions next time.